welcome to the CNN IBN special. He's been called one of the greatest literary voices of our time. He's lived for 9 years under a fatwa which ordered his execution. He's immensely popular, also controversial, and he's just published his long-awaited memoir, Joseph Anton. Salman Rushdie, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
It's a big book,
yeah.
Almost 700 pages.
Yeah, 630. So,
right.
Yeah, yes.
It's gripping and it's very moving. What's moving about it, I thought, was that your dogged and persistent courage in the face of those harrowing circumstances keeps coming through.
Thank you.
Why did you feel that this was the right time for you to write this memoir, to tell your personal story?
Just because I felt I had enough distance from the material to do a proper job, for a long time I didn't want to write it because I felt too close to it emotionally, and frankly, when I escaped from that cage, the last thing I wanted was to go put myself back in the cage to write about it. So I've waited until I felt I could approach the subject properly.
You write in the book that you became a man in those years of the fatwa. Nobody loved, but many hated. You became that man. Is this book in some sense a defense? Is it a reaching out to the people who hated you to tell them about what exactly you're like?
No, it's not a defense. In fact, I think one of the things about it is that it's very undefended. It's a book in which it's very unguarded, the way the self-portrait. And in many ways, the portrait is very self-critical. Because I think when you write a book like this, you actually have to be tougher on yourself than anyone else. So I basically approached it really the same way that I would approach a novel. I wanted to make three-dimensional characters, including myself, because I think if the characters don't come off the page as living people, then readers don't care about them. And if you don't care about them, you don't care so much what happens to them. So I think in that sense, it's not different than writing a novel.
It's very much like a novel, in fact. It's written also in the third person.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because I tried to write it in the first. I started off writing it in the first person. I didn't like it, and I just felt there was something wrong with the tone of voice of it. It felt a little too self-regarding, a little too narcissistic somehow. And also because I wanted to be objective about everybody, I wanted to be super objective about myself. I just felt that by writing it in the third person, it was like I could slightly step to one side, and look at the character with my name, and write about that person more truthfully in a way, more objectively, and more critically.
And it's also, in parts incredibly funny. There are bits that really make you laugh out loud.
Well, there were things that I've often said to my friends in those years. I said, if it wasn't for the fact that this isn't funny, it would be very funny. And there were moments, for instance, I think it's pretty strange that the closest I came to being killed in those years was when I had a car accident in Australia with a truck that was full of fertilizer.
Full of dung. This
truckload of dung, which fortunately didn't spill all over me, but that was the closest I came to be, and I felt it. There was a ridiculous moment after this accident in which nobody was killed. When the police showed up, they started interrogating this poor Australian truck driver as if he was an Islamic terrorist.
The book is called Joseph Anton, but it could easily have been called Ajeeb Mamuli. I love that name. That was the name that you originally suggested to the police.
I know. I never thought they'd buy it.
Why does the name Ajeeb Mamuli exemplify your predicament?
Well, because of the contradiction, that it's both strange and ordinary.
Your life changed after that fatwa, and you've written. It was not just the book, but it was because of the political situation that Khomeini found himself in, that your book was simply a political way in which he could regain the momentum of the Iranian revolution.
Yeah, I think the truth is, Khomeini died quite soon after that, and I've often thought that if life had been a little different, if he had died a few months earlier, or if the book had been published a few months later, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It really was just sort of my bad luck to be his last stand.
In that sense, because your book became not about the agitation was not about your book, but because of what it represented, the political symbol of anti-Islamism that you became. Do you feel that that is a burden that you continue to carry, to be this political symbol of anti-Islamism?
Well, not exactly. I think what happened is that in the Muslim world, there was a very successful attempt to demonize me, and to turn me into this kind of enemy, And I think the legacy of that is still there. I think there's a lot of the Muslim world that still thinks like that, and there's not much I can do about it. In the end, you can't think about too much about how other people define you. You have to just go on down your road. And my view is, I never even thought of myself as primarily a religious writer. I just happened to write a book in which one of the characters was involved with the subject of Islam. But that's never was primarily where my interest lay. In fact, even in that book, Islam is very much a sub-theme in that book. It's mostly a novel about immigrants in England and having to adapt to the situation, the new life in a new world. So, it feels like a shame that there's a big chunk of the world in which my name has been so blackened, and all I can hope is that with the passage of time that changes.
Yeah, and you also write about India today and its role in lighting the fire. The sensational headline that they came up with, which was an unequivocal attack on religious fundamentalism. That was how they extracted your book. They broke the embargo and extracted satanic verses. Do you continue to believe that that article in India today did a lot of damage?
That's what lit the fire. I mean, truthfully, given the scale of what then followed, probably if that had not done it, something else would have done it. But as it happened, that is what did it.
And it was an inaccurate reading of the book.
It was a very distorted reading of the book, and it was published before the book had ever reached India. So it meant nobody could read the book for themselves and see what it was actually about, and it allowed these couple of Muslim MPs, led by Shahabuddin, to get the book prohibited before any copies had reached the country. So it was banned without ever being looked at. And that seemed shocking to me. And one of the reasons why I think it's shocking is because since that time, the attacks on free expression in India have mounted. And it's become easier and easier to begin to attack writers, painters, scholars, cartoonists.
We'll come to that in just a bit. I want to ask you whether you're still as proud of India's openness as you once were. As you've written, you've always been proud of India's open democracy, but you're not anymore. But let me just come back to the fatwa for a minute. The fatwa ruined your life for those 9 years. But it also made you into this kind of global icon of free speech. Is that a role that you relished? Is that a role that you...
Well, I don't know whether you relish it, but I mean, I think one of the things I felt when I regained my liberty was that it was very important that this didn't just happen to me, that there are a lot of writers under attack in a lot of countries, not just Muslim countries. There's a lot of attacks on free speech in parts of Africa and in much of China and elsewhere in Asia. And even in certain corners of Europe. And America, there was an attempt to ban J.K. Rowling in America because it was suggested that her books promoted devil worship, witchcraft. And so I felt that I had been strongly defended by a lot of my fellow writers in those years. And I thought it was time to give something back, And so one of the reasons why I became very involved with the free speech subject and with free speech groups, like the PEN Writers Organization, was precisely that. I thought, I'm not the only person in the history to whom this has happened. There are other people in danger, other people under attack every day. And I wanted to do my bit for them, just as many people had done their bit for me.
And you also write very interestingly that there can't be two theories of Islam, that there's one true Islam of faith and love and there's another Islam of the bloody theocracies. You believe that that's wrong. There are no two Islams. It's just that one Islam, and that Islam is in crisis.
I think there's something has gone seriously wrong. I'm just talking about in my lifetime. When I was a kid, many of these cities which in the Muslim world, which are now in a state of such crisis, Beirut, Damascus, Tehran, Baghdad, within our lifetime, those cities were very different places. Tehran was a great cosmopolitan capital, intellectual, artistic, cosmopolitan capital. Beirut, so much so that people used to call it the Paris of the East, with good reason. And so the Muslim culture within our lifetime has been something much more open, much more tolerant, much more interested in the world outside Islam, not so closed off, not so paranoid. And I felt that was a richer way to live, just for people. I'm not very theological. I'm talking about how human beings live their lives, and I know that, Pakistan used to be a very different place, than the Pakistan that now exists. It was never a place in which people rammed religion down your throats, oddly. Every time Pakistanis were actually given a chance to vote, they would vote against the religious parties and for the secular parties. So, as I say, within my lifetime, there has been this other Islam, which was a much more attractive thing, I think. And what has now developed is a harsher Islam, which partly because of the spread of Wahhabi ideas, with the help of colossal amounts of Saudi oil money, partly because of the rise of the Ayatollahs in Shia Islam, different reasons in different places, there has spread this much harsher, less tolerant Islam. The idea that...
And is it spreading? Is it growing stronger?
Well, I don't know. You could argue that both ways. I think it's attractive to a lot of particularly young men, and I think one of the
glamorous and
particularly for people who's, many of these countries are economically very disadvantaged, and the prospects for young people of making a good life for themselves and marrying, raising a family, these things, it's very improbable that they would ever be able to do anything like that because they're just close to destitute, and the jihad seemed to give them a direction, and a purpose and a sense of self-importance and so on, and you can see that that's alluring to certain kinds of people. But as against that, it's quite clear that most of the people who've been really oppressed by Islamic radicalism are Muslims. The people most oppressed by the Taliban were the people of Afghanistan. The people most oppressed by the Ayatollahs are the people of Iran, and so on. So you feel that in the end, or even maybe beginning already, that there's a rejection of that kind of Islam. Whatever happens in the so-called Arab Spring or in the aftermath of it, much of the aftermath is disappointing, but I think the big losers of that whole movement are the jihadis, because the one thing that it showed, all those movements across the Arab world showed, was that you could actually change your society in another way. You didn't need to be... But
except that, as you know, the US ambassador to Libya has just been killed because of that documentary on the Prophet.
I know, but we don't know. You see, I just want to not do the kind of Mitt Romney thing of shooting my mouth off before I know what I'm talking about. Because there seems to be some doubt about why the attack took place. And like today there's a story that it might be actually a September 11 related attack, a sort of planned professional attack, rather than a response to this film. Obviously this film is a piece of garbage, but a piece of garbage doesn't justify killing people who had nothing to do with the piece of garbage.
Let's talk a little bit about you and religion. You write very often in the book about your own atheism and your own humanism, but you still say you're fascinated by God and religion. In fact, you say it was curious, it's so avowedly a godless person should keep on trying to write about faith.
Yeah.
So why is that? If you're so religious, why are you fascinated by religion?
Well, because it's surged back into the center of the narrative of our times. I think I'm a creature of the, I'm a creature of the 60s, that stupid decade, and one of the things we all thought at that time was that religion was over, dead subject, that was in the past, and that we were talking about different things. The idea that that religion would return to the center of the stage, would have seemed absurd if you had said that to anybody in 1968. And we were all wrong. They were all wrong. And I think it's not just Islam. I think the rise of the Hindutva, I think that's a very worrying thing. And I think, I live in New York, and this is an election year, and you can see all around you the power of the Christian right,
Why do you think that is? Why do you think religion is enjoying this kind of renaissance?
I don't know. It's a mystery to me, because I find it so difficult to join that club, but it's partly, I think, to do with the fact that the world is changing at a colossal and unpredictable speed, and many of the old certainties dissolve in our hands. The way the world was yesterday is not the way the world is tomorrow. And I think often in times of such rapid transformation, there are people who sort of clutch at certainty, and the thing about religion is that it offers you a thing that is fixed, in a world that is metamorphosing all around you. It offers you something which feels permanent, and eternal.
So in your mind, is religion wrong? Is it just untrue? Are the gods are all unnecessary and irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that, yes. I think what's happened in our time is that religion has moved out of the private arena, and I think in the private sphere, it's nobody's business. It's between you and your God, the moment it moves into the public sphere, it becomes everybody's business, and I think that's what's happened, and that's why I've taken an interest here.
But at the same time, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, you say that you were possessed by a complex grief, and that you do feel part of the Muslim culture of the subcontinent.
Well, of course, yes, but that Muslim culture is part of Indian culture, and that ridiculous attempt by the Hindu right to describe the Muslim part of Indian history as being somehow inauthentic, is clearly, that's inauthentic itself. So I often thought, if India had any sense of its own history, it would have a protected monuments law, like most countries do.
So why were you sad when the Babri Masjid was demolished, if you're not a believing
Well, because it's beautiful. Because it's beautiful, and because it's a link to the history of the country, And I'm, by training, a historian, and I'm interested in beauty, and I'm interested in architecture. And the Babri Masjid was a beautiful thing, and it was one of the oldest such buildings in the country. And, I would feel sad if somebody went and knocked down the Taj, we have this, in India we have this very complicated old history, and by the way, everything is built on top of something else. When you have a country as old as this, a culture as old as this, everything's on top of something. So you could dig under a Hindu temple and find a Buddhist temple.
But as far as you're concerned, you do visualize yourself or see yourself as an Indian, as a South Asian Muslim.
I don't see myself as a South Asian Muslim. I see myself as an Indian person, from a Muslim family.
Right.
And my family varied a lot. My own parents were not observed. My mother not really observant at all, apart from not wanting to eat pig. That was the extent of Islam. In our house, no pigs. My father was very openly atheistic, and communicated that to me, as I have communicated it to my children, I have to say.
So you're an atheist and
Yes.
a humanist.
Yes, perfectly reasonable thing to be. And I was talking to my sister about this recently, and she said that the thing that she felt that I had done in the Satanic Verses was just to make that statement that nothing is off limits, that there can't be areas that you can't discuss, and that may be what some people didn't like.
Did you ever feel that your enemies had a point? Did you ever feel that there was something in the Satanic Verses
No.
which if you could, you would do differently?
No, they didn't have a point. They were wrong.
Let's come to India. You were talking about that you see yourself as an Indian person now. Midnight Children is your classic book. It's the winner of the Booker of Bookers, and it's actually defining an entire culture, an entire generation. You and India are the same age. You're like twins.
Yes.
Is that 1947 generation unique? Do you think that you became a writer because you were born in 1947?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that it's a transitional generation. You know, I think and generations of transition are always interesting, and unlike what came before and what comes after. You know, we know enough about decolonization to know that it doesn't end on the day that the colonial power leaves. You know, that there's an aftermath, there's a sort of aftershock, you know, and it's certainly the case that my generation growing up, there was still a lot more of a kind of English leftover legacy hanging over India, you know, and slowly the emergence of a national identity, if you like, you know, and one of the things that interests me about the Bombay movies in those days is that many of the filmmakers consciously thought they were engaged in the business of nation building. You know, that the films were, many of the films, and not just Mother India, you know, but many of the films were there in order to try and develop a kind of sense of the nation, you know, in audiences. And that, you know, that was the generation in which that's what people were trying to do. They were trying to create the nation, you know, because again, the nation is not fully born on the day it's born. You know, it's like any newborn baby, it has to develop and mature and grow up, you know, and so I guess we were that generation.
What comes across in your book actually repeatedly is your love for India, your enormous attachment to India, how India inspires you and how you consider yourself a Bombay boy. And you also say that the wounds inflicted by India were the deepest.
Yes.
And India has hurt you. India was the first to ban satanic verses, and now your film Midnight Children has not found an Indian distributor.
Well, I mean, I think the press has been just a little bit ahead of itself there. You know, I mean, we only showed it at the Toronto Film Festival last weekend. And I mean, I spoke with the producer yesterday, and he said he's having a lot of conversations. You know, I mean, I don't think that subject is over. You know, so I think the press has just been a little too quick to jump. You know, I saw some stupid story saying that India was insisting that my voiceover narration be taken off the film so that it could be shown, and that's just garbage. There's no such story. You know, it's just that somebody made that up. You know, and certainly we would not do that. You know, but as I say, let's wait and see.
Right, but broadly, you know, the kind of rebuffs that India has repeatedly given you, has that hurt you a lot?
Yeah, yeah. I've heard some stories about how my books get rejected for university syllabuses because people say, "Oh, he's not really an Indian writer," you know. I think, really, you know, I mean, in what sense? Where is the foreign blood? You know, and that's insulting, you know, because I think that whatever you think about me, you know, these books have been influential in the development of Indian literature, and so at the very least they should be studied.
Just to come back to the point you were making about intolerance, do you worry that India is no longer that haven of creative thinking and freedom of thought?
I do, because I think all you have to do is to look at the attacks that have taken place recently. You know, the attack on Ramanujan's essay about the 300 Ramayans, you know, and the fact that it was removed from the Delhi University syllabus, the attack on Rohinton Mistri's novel, which was immediately removed from the Bombay University syllabus, you know, this attack on the cartoonist for his, I mean, perfectly okay cartoon. You know, it seems to me, I mean, India has such a great tradition of political cartooning. You know, we didn't just discover this art, you know, we've been very good at it, as a matter of fact, and suddenly everybody's getting so thin-skinned that it becomes very difficult to do it. You know, there's no such thing as a respectful political cartoon. You know, the nature of the form is disrespectful, you know, and you know, the leaders of the country in the early days after independence were constantly lampooned in cartoons and never attempted to suppress them. You know, so we've become too thin-skinned, maybe.
And does Hindu intolerance bother you as much as Islamic intolerance? Because Hindutva intolerance also is behind many of these attacks.
Well, I mean, in India, certainly in India, you know, it's actually more dangerous because there's simply more Hindus. You know, I mean, so it's that majoritarian intolerance is always the most worrying. You know, for instance, the case of Hussain, being attacked for painting Saraswati unclothed. Well, I want to see the pictures of Saraswati clothed. Who paints them? Who paints those? Where are they? You know, where are the statues of Saraswati wearing a dress? You know, etc. You know, the way in which Hindu deities have always been depicted is substantially unclothed. You know, they're very ornamented. You know, they're always wearing jewels. But the amount of clothing has never been an issue, you know. So obviously it wasn't that. It was that it was a Muslim artist painting a Hindu goddess in that way. So it was, in fact, it was a sectarian attack. It wasn't really about the pictures, because, as I say, that's how Saraswati is always depicted, you know. So, but the fact that Hussain was lost to India for so long, and that much of his work has been permanently lost to India as a result, is a tragedy, you know. And there are so many of these stories now. You know, the attack on the museum, on the library in Pune,
Darker Institute,
yeah,
for James Lane's
because
book.
of James Lane's book. I mean, like it seems like every day there's another story, and that, I think, has enormously endangered free expression in India, and I think it's something for Indians to think about.
Welcome back to the CNN IBN special. We're talking to Salman Rushdie about his new memoir, Joseph Anton. You don't speak about Pakistan in anywhere as near as affectionate terms as you do about India. In fact, you also talk about the assassination of Salman Taseer, the liberal politician who was assassinated, and then his assassin became the hero because he was this Islamic zealot. Are you not at all optimistic about a liberal Pakistan emerging?
What is clear to me is that something has changed in Pakistan, because, as I say, the people, the ordinary people, never used to be that infected with Islamist extremism. You know, the people were always very moderate in their opinions and in their religion. You know, that was one of the interesting characteristics of, you know, that a state which was founded for a religion never really made that big a deal of the religion. It's partly because, of course, Jinnah was, to say the least, not particularly religious.
To say the least.
Exactly. But I feel that incidents like the attack on Salman Taseer, like the arrest of this poor little girl,
on the blasphemy law case,
just so distressing that this should happen. These are signs that, and the reaction to those things in Pakistan, you know, has been an indication that maybe public opinion is shifting, you know, en bloc towards a more, towards a harsher interpretation of Islam, and that's a great worry.
Do you see that happening to Indian Muslims as well? Indian Muslims also shifting to that harsher Islam?
I mean, maybe there's a little bit of it, you know. I mean, for instance, even in a place like Kashmir, where the kind of Islam on offer used to always be very Sufi influenced Islam, you see the beginnings of this harsher Arabized Islam, you know, and I think that is beginning to spread. And there, of course, are groups in India, Muslim groups, who are interested to push that harsher ideology. So that's a great shame, because I think, you know, the Indian Islam in which I grew up was always a very open, tolerant, argumentative, talkative, you know, very cultured community. A lot of the great poets of India came out of that tradition, and it would be a shame for it to be lost.
Let's talk a little bit about writers from India. You published in the 50th year of Indian independence that anthology, which became controversial because you said something pretty politically incorrect, saying that Bhasha writers are nowhere as good as the Indians writing in English. Do you still believe that?
You know, truthfully, one of the things about making an anthology is that you always get into trouble because all the writers who are in the anthology say, obviously. And all the writers who are not in the anthology say, I hate you. So it just taught me a lesson not to do anthologies. You know, I just think it was an interesting moment the last 30 years because the great development of Indian writing in English, you know, has been just, whatever you think of the Bhasha writers, let's say the most interesting new phenomenon has been this explosion of Indian writing in English. And a lot of very interesting and very different writers have emerged. You know, and one of the things I think that's good for the health of the literature is that it should not all be the same. You know, that there should be a very wide diversity of talent. And I think now that's the case, you know, that you have writers from the very kind of high artistic end, you know, to a very popular end. You know, you can go from, I don't know, Amit Chaudhary to Chetan Bhagat, you know.
You're not very warm in your book towards Arundhati Roy. You quote her as saying to the media that her work is truthful and your work was exotic, and then you called up her agent and you asked whether she had in fact said this, and then she wrote back to you saying she hadn't. You know, are you not an Arundhati Roy fan?
How can I put this? No.
You're not?
No, I'm not.
Why not?
I'm going to leave it alone, you know. I think she should go her way and I'll go mine.
But you did have a disagreement with her on, for example, how she interpreted Islamic militancy.
No, well, I mean, you see, I agreed with her about some things. I mean, when she was involved in the campaign about the Narmada Valley dams, you know, I mean, I wrote in support of that campaign, you know, so it's not a kind of blanket disapproval. I think the way in which she responded to the terrorist attacks in Bombay was something that I took exception to, you know, as did many people from Bombay, by the way. I thought her remarks were in very poor taste.
Because you keep saying that you can't tie up Islamic militancy to a search for justice. It's not as if this is justice denied and therefore youth are becoming militant. This is just an obscurantist movement.
Well, I think it's about power, not justice. You know, I think that's to say, it seems to me that when religion acquires this militant political dimension, it's about power. The purpose is I mean, the Taliban weren't about justice. They were about a power grab. So is Al-Qaeda, you know, so is where, so you have to see it as a manifestation of a desire for power, not a manifestation of a desire for justice. And that's one of the things. No, I mean, you know, she has said that herself how much she differs politically from me, so let's just leave it at that.
Let's talk a little bit about the personal aspects of your book, which are incredibly honest, searingly honest. And you write in quite a sort of honest way about your wife Padma Lakshmi, your former wife.
Well, there's only a little bit about Padma, yeah. But there she is, yeah.
But you say all kinds of interesting things about her. You call her the illusion. You say she was your pipe dream who always dressed as Pocahontas on Halloween.
Well, she does. It's not untrue. I mean, I think some of that language comes from something that was said to me by my ex-wife Elizabeth, where she said that, you know, that I had succumbed to an illusion. So that's where that term comes from. Look, I mean, I tried to be fair about Padma because I think we did fall in love and we were together for a long time, and a lot of that time was happy. You know, I mean, of the 8 years. It was a good relationship before it became a bad one, you know, and it's not the first time in the history of the human race that happened, you know. And what I was trying to say, that there was the part of it that I think that maybe I got wrong, was to load too much expectation on her, you know, that for her to become this kind of metaphor, you know, of a kind of Indian past joined to an American future and so on. this ridiculous fact that I met her under the Statue of Liberty, you know,
Right.
which I literally did, you know. I mean, I tried to say that that in many ways she was very courageous, you know, at that moment that I was just beginning to regain the ability to lead an open life. You know, she was the person willing to stand next to me.
But you're very honest about your relationships and your role in your failed marriages
Well,
or
I think
your
this is-
former marriages. Do you have trouble being faithful?
No, I mean, many of these were very long relationships, you know, I mean, and during which I was very faithful. I mean, you know, if you're married to somebody for 14 years and then it breaks up, it doesn't mean you have a problem being faithful, you know. You know, one of these relationships was 14 years, one was 10 years, and one was 8. You know, I mean, that's a lot of time.
But your second wife, for example, Marianne, I mean, she sounds, as we say in India, mental.
Well,
She sounds really like mental.
you said it. I didn't.
But again, you very honestly wrote about that relationship.
Well, you know, she, at the point that we broke up, she gave an interview which was published on the front page of the London Sunday Times, in which she called me every name in the book, you know, and that was more than 20 years ago. So I think I've been quite patient.
At the end of the book, you quote a long debate which you had with John le Carré about free speech. And John le Carré made the point that free speech is fine, but you can't insult great religions. And you made the point that no, free speech is important. Do you continue to believe that free speech is absolute?
Yes.
And within it, it includes the right to offend religion?
Yes, I'm tired of religion demanding special privileges. You know, I mean, you know, get over it. You know, there's no other idea in the world that demands protection. You know, if ideas are strong, they can stand criticism. You know, and there has to be, in any open society, you have to be able to discuss everything in whatever terms you choose. You know, that's just the nature of openness. You know, otherwise you're starting to create a semi-closed society. And I mean, I think in a way I regret the argument with John le Carré, because I admire him as a writer, and I prefer not to have had it. But I think there are 2 points to make. One is specifically about religion, that in the 18th century in Europe, the writers of the European Enlightenment, who basically forged what we now think of as the modern idea of free expression, they very much knew that their battle was not against the state, it was against the church. And in those days, the Christian church, with its inquisitions and anathemas and excommunications and so on, had a whole range of weapons with which it tried to limit what could be said, what could be discussed, you know. And it's clear that those writers, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Montesquieu, they saw that the battle for freedom was to be fought against that, you know. So this is just another chapter of that, you know. So different religions, but
Right.
same battle. The other point that he made, Le Carré, was he said that if you take on a known enemy and then it starts behaving as you know that it does, then you can't be surprised and you can't ask for sympathy. Well, if that's true, then the entire noble history of writers confronting tyrants is to be dismissed, because they knew, you know, Mandelstam knew what Stalin was like, you know, Lorca knew what Franco was like, you know. Writers have always taken on tyranny, always, knowing that it's tyranny, knowing that it endangers them, and still doing it because they think it's important to do.
So you think art is always on a collision course with power?
Not always, not all art, not all power, you know. But it seems that whenever a country falls into the hands of authoritarian or tyrannical rulers, the first thing they try and do is to shut down artistic expression. It seems to be what they're most afraid of, you know. And it's odd, because writers have no armies, you know, and yet they are still, to this day, you know, what tyrants fear most. You know, there's a great line in Italo Calvino's novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, and he says that you could always tell, I'll slightly misquote, but still, you could always tell the degree of respect that a country has for literature by the size of the apparatus that it sets up to repress it. And there's, you know, there's a truth in that.
Just on that point about literature, again, there's a lot of nostalgia in your book about a time when literature was important. You quote the words of Shelley, where you say writers were once the unacknowledged legislators of the world. You hark back nostalgically to a time when ideas and books were important. Do you lament the sort of declining importance of the book and the reading culture?
You know, now in America, for instance, instead of having the likes of Susan Sontag and Norman Mailer and so on commenting on the world, you have instead the people who do, the artists who do have that ability are movie stars. You know, so if you're George Clooney or Angelina Jolie or whatever, then you have a voice in politics. You know, whereas writers tend not to in America. I mean, in other parts of the world, it's still better than that.
You speak a lot in your book about finding a voice, about finding your voice as a writer. Have you become the writer that you always wanted to be?
Oh, well, I mean, I think the thing about being a writer is that it's an endless process of becoming, because you don't stay where you are. You know, I mean, I'm not any longer the same as the person who wrote Midnight Children, for instance. You know, I mean, when that book started, I was probably 28. You know, I mean, when it was published, I was 33. And, you know, 32 years later, I'm not the same person. You know? I probably couldn't write that book now, and I suspect that young fellow couldn't write what I'm writing now. You know, so you go through an endless process of becoming. Your relationship with language changes. Your relationship with, you know, your subjects change. You feel that you've done something enough, and you want to do something else. And you know, it's a journey. You know, and I think that's, fortunately, one of the great things about doing this job is you don't have to stop. You know, you don't. I mean, I'm actually, you know, at 65, I'm retirement age. You know. What's
the best way, as a last question, what's the best way to keep up the fight against bigotry and zealotry and defend freedom of speech? You've often said the argument is the most important thing. Yeah. What's the best way to defend freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, fearlessness. You know, I mean, let's say we live in a very timid time, partly because there have been all these threats and attacks and so on. But I think the artist, at least, must continue to be fearless, you know, and do his work without regard to those kinds of consequences. And then it's up to the society as a whole to make sure that the space in which art can flourish, you know, is protected. And maybe India is not doing such a good job.
Salman Rushdie, thanks very much indeed for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.